What up, nerds? This video is going to be covering how input is handled in Godot. It can be a complex topic, but it is also pretty important to understand how your input actually gets handled inside of the engine. So, starting off, you have a couple different ways to actually handle the input. The most common way that you'll see is people using the input singleton inside of, say, something like process or physics process. And it's that one where you see the if input dot is action pressed, that line right there. That's actually utilizing the input singleton, which I'll be covering at the end of this video. But I want to focus on the other ways to actually handle the input that you receive, because if you utilize this correctly, it allows you to give a pretty good distinction of responsibilities. So let's go ahead and get started. I went ahead and drew this little simple diagram to show how input is actually handled. When Godot receives an input, it will give it to the scene tree, and then the scene tree will give it to the viewport. And the viewport is actually what handles the input. It's what sends it to these different functions. And starting from top to bottom, you have the input function, the GUI input function, the unhandled input function, the input event, which is for collision objects, and then if none of these actually handle the input, it'll be sent to the next viewport in line. So again, the input event will hit this topmost input event, then it'll check to see if the GUI input is applicable, which is only applicable for control derived nodes. And then it'll go to the unhandled input, this collision object's input event, and then it'll go to the next viewport in line. I just wanted to reiterate because it is important to know this process. So what do I mean though is that it'll propagate, or if it's not handled, and things like that. The input propagation, it means that even though this function will actually receive the input and do something with it, this function can receive it as well as that function, so on and so forth. Now, if you don't want the event to keep propagating to the next input handling function, you need to mark it as handled, which we'll go over as well. So I have a couple scenes actually set up to demonstrate some of this behavior. I have this basic input node. Let me go ahead and close all that out. Some weirdness was going on right there. I have this basic input node, and then I have this child input node, and they both have the basic input.gd and child input.gd respectively. Now, if you see, both of them are overriding the input function. Now, it is important to understand that these input functions, they are executed from a bottom to top order instead of a top to bottom order. So what's going to happen is if I press the escape key, I'm going to print the name of the node that the script is currently on. So I press escape, the child input node gets printed first, and then the basic input node, because it operates from a bottom to top fashion when it comes to these input events. So now what I mean by setting an event as handled, if we look here, the basic input node's name got printed, but if I want to stop the propagation, what I need to do is get the scene tree and then pretty much mark the input as handled, telling the scene tree like, hey, do not send this anywhere else. So now when I run it and I press escape, only the child input gets printed out. All right. And remember, this input event is the first stop in the chain of input functions. So if I, let's say, go ahead and copy this and then overwrite the unhandled input, which is this third function that it'll hit. But in this basic input, I mark it as handled here. What's going to happen is, well, let me go ahead and comment this out so it doesn't get executed. The basic input's name will be printed out because this is the unhandled input and this is just input. So because it's the unhandled input, it will be hit after the input function. Because remember, bottom to top. All right. So now that we've went ahead and covered some of the basics, let's go ahead and move on to using the user interface. We can go ahead and bring these up. So with the user interface, it can kind of throw some people in a loop, and that's because the user interface has a couple different ways to like handle mouse input, and that's through this mouse collapsible section over here, this filter property. You know, sometimes you might have your control overlapping another control, and then that one that is overlapping the control one of the controls, it's capturing the mouse input, and then the filter set to stop. So that means when a mouse click happens or any kind of mouse event happens, it pretty much consuming that input and marking it as handled. So you keep that in mind as well. But going to the three methods that we were mainly focusing on, we have the unhandled input is what is overwritten in this top node. And then in this second node, we have the GUI input overwritten. And then in the line edit, we also have the GUI input overwritten. Now, if you see here, we have this accept event method. And then this is actually how you handle an event with a control derived node. Instead of getting the tree and setting the input as handled, you would call this accept event. I'm just going to comment that out for right now. So again, it goes from a bottom to top order. Now, what we can do is press F6. If I click on this control out here, because this GUI input is overwritten, it is receiving the input because I'm not clicking on the line edit, and the GUI input, which maps to this root node, doesn't handle it, and it can't handle it because it is not a control derived node. So now if I press escape, only the unhandled input is getting captured. Well, it's pretty much being handled because the line edit is only capturing the GUI input. All right. And the user interface node that uses the GUI input script, it is overriding the unhandled input. And then if I press escape, it prints the name. Now, as you can see here, it's not, I can't click on this because it is being handled by this control node, which is the GUI input, and the mouse is set to stop. Now, something I can do, if I click on this node, the line edit, you'll see that it's the line edit node prints, but the control node doesn't print. And that is because the line edit, when it receives a mouse action, it also stops, so it handles that as well. Now that I'm in here, I can actually do some key presses as well. So I have the line edit, and then I have the user interface. And that is because, let's go and bring up the output again. The line edit, it still receives it and then sends it on its merry way. It does not actually mark it as handled. So this unhandled input, it will still receive the event as well. Because remember, it goes GUI input and then unhandled input. So now if I uncomment out that and then go in here and press escape, only the line edit gets printed out. And that is because we're marking it as handled. All right. Now, not every control node can actually capture a key input event, such as like the base control node, because it's not able to just receive those events. The reason sometimes this line edit node doesn't like receive these GUI inputs is because it is not what is actually in focus. When I click on it, it becomes the UI focused element. All right, so that's something to keep in mind as well. So let's take a look at the collision input. So right here, what I have here, and just a reminder, we're now looking at this input event right here, which is specific to collision objects. So we go over here to the node tab and then look at the signals, and down here in the collision object we have this input event. It is connected to this root node's script, and then if it's the left click, I'm going to print out the name. All right. Okay, so we have the name, and it is very important to know that the only way for this to work, there are a couple criteria that needs to be met. One, there needs to be a camera in the scene. Two, the rigid body or the collision object must have this input ray pickable checked. So if I uncheck that, I can't click it. Check it back, I can click it. And last but not least, this will come in handy when you start messing with multiple viewports, is in the viewport, it needs to have this physics object picking property checked as well. So if we turn that off, it doesn't work. Now, the reason it requires a camera is because what happens is when you click and it gets to that event, it shoots out a raycast from the camera to try and simulate, well, to try and get any information for the click. All right. And just to kind of drill home the, let's do this, the way like it actually works, we can just take all this out and say clicked. So now get tree set input is handled, because remember, I'm overriding the input, which is this right here, and then I'm going to mark it as handled, so it should never get to this event, well, this function right here to be handled, because I'm handling it in the input function. So let's go ahead and run it. Now I'm going to try and click on the cube, and as you can see, it is not actually running this input event right here because I am consuming it at an earlier stage. Okay. So now let's go ahead and look at this quick little viewport setup that I did. We want to bring up this one, and this one. All right. So the way this works is I'm going to go to move the viewport input up, and then the camera input, and then the camera 2 input. So the viewport input script is on the root node, The camera input script is on this camera right here, and camera 2 script is on this camera right here. So now that all of them except the root node is handling input. So unhandled input for the root node, and the two cameras are using input. So if I go in here and I press escape, everything should work, right? Now, if camera 2 marks the input as handled, these two will not receive it. Okay? So it should only print camera 2, which it does. All right. And, the same thing would happen with here. And it's because, it's just propagating those events. Because remember, it goes input, GUI input, and the GUI input is only applicable for control-derived nodes. And then it goes to unhandled input, the input event for collision objects, and then it goes to the next viewport for the next viewport to handle the input. Now, that pretty much covers how all the input works in that sense. But as mentioned at the beginning of the video, there is another way where we actually handle input, and that is through the... Now let me go and close these, and that is through the input singleton. So what you'll often see is, say, process or physics process, and then we go if input dot is action pressed, and then cancel because that's escape. We'll just print out print. Well, pressed, I mean. So now when we do this, it works as expected. All right. And the reason the child input was still being received was because, the unhandled input, nothing's being actually handled and everything. So the input singleton is kind of an oddball. You can look at it as managing its own input state, because even if we mark, say, this input event up here as handled, you'll still be able to do something with this is action pressed. All right. So if I press escaped, I'm just going to press it once. We have the basic input, and then you still get input from here. And that is because, like I said, you can just look at it as handling its own input state. So, now that you kind of have an idea of how all of this works, the next question is, well, how do I use these things? Typically, you want to use this style of processing the input for things that you would need to poll constantly. Most common is getting an input vector for movement. You'll see that most often in, say, process or physics process, is action pressed, move right or move left or what have you. And that's perfectly fine. Every single frame of process or physics process, it's going to check the input singleton saying, hey, is this action actually being pressed? Which, you can set up your actions and project settings and then the input map right here. Now, the question for the other input events comes down to as such. So the input event is the first one that the input function is the first function that the input event hits. So you can handle all kinds of input in here. One example would be, maybe this is where you want to do your key press to open your inventory. And then if you press it again, it closes your inventory. All right. And then for the GUI input, this is, it's where you would want to put your pretty much UI handled input. As this is UI centric input handling function. All right. So like pretty much like I showed in the control section of this video. And then an unhandled input, this is generally where you would want to put your gameplay code. Say like you have left click to attack, and you just want to attack once or whatever. Every time you hit the left click one time, you could put that in unhandled input. That way, when your inventory is open, um, and your GUI is handling the input, when you say left click on an item, your character's not attacking because it's being consumed in the GUI input. So that's an example of where you can where you would find the unhandled input applicable. And then for the input event, this one is just going to really come down to your own personal game. For how you want to handle these collision objects and actually clicking on them. One example, you could use this for, say, shooting a cannonball. Maybe you want to like drag, you want to click on the cannonball, drag your mouse over some to kind of give it some force, and then let go, and then it kind of slingshots the cannonball. It's completely up to you. This one is probably not going to be used as often as the other three, which is the input, the GUI input, and the unhandled input, but it is still worth knowing about this. Now, I just want to stress that, remember, these input functions get processed from a bottom to top fashion. It is very important to remember that. Now, if you have any questions, please let me know, and go out and be nerds.